Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of KISS Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of organic growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. You know, it's about time that I did a podcast focused just on lighting. This is not a topic that I'm all that strong on, so it was great to sit down with some experts in the field and get to ask some questions to learn more. My guests this week are Travis Williams and Travis Higgenbotham. Yes, two Travises, so it's a little tricky to tell them apart, but between the two of them, we get to hear about very different aspects of the lighting industry. Travis Williams is the Director of Brand Marketing at Fluence Bioengineering. He is passionate about clean energy, sustainability, and controlled environment agriculture. His job allows him to help growers navigate the challenging and complex world of horticultural lighting to realize improvements in crop production, sustainability, and profits through LED technology. Travis Higgenbotham is the new Director of Cultivation Support for Fluence. Prior to working at Fluence, he worked at a state-of-the-art, environmentally controlled greenhouse covering 50 acres where he was the head of research and development. They grew annual and perennial crops for big box retailers supplying the Northeast United States. His focus was on rearing beneficial insects, IPM protocols, disease testing, and trialing new genetics from around the world. He recently received his master's in horticulture from Virginia Tech, where he did some work around LED research in regards to sole source, supplemental, and photoperiodic lighting. This resulted in equipping irrigation booms with lights for photoperiodic flowering applications to a controlled environment where he propagated over 1.2 million perennials from stage 3 tissue culture per year. He also has a Bachelor's of Science from Clemson University. In this podcast, we go over a bit of the history of lighting as it relates to growing plants, as well as the future of lighting and what exciting research is currently being done in the industry. All right, hey guys, I really want to thank you today for coming out and chatting with me about lighting.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yep, thank you, Ted.
Yeah, so can I get started finding out a little bit about your backgrounds? Now we have two Travises here, so maybe Travis Williams, you could tell us a little bit more about how you came to the role that you have now?
Yeah, gladly. So I've spent about 13 years in high-tech marketing. The last 3 of those years have been with Fluence. And then the decade before that was across different industries, both high-tech and green tech, everything from embedded systems to alternative fuels, all B2B companies, large and small, with a core emphasis on efficiency and really moving the world towards a more sustainable, efficient future with all kinds of different technologies. And then about 3 years ago, I started to see the convergence of technology and horticulture with vertical farming and different technologies that were coming online. And that's really what spurred my interest in looking at how to take technology and make it very applicable to our agriculture industry and our food supply chain. And so I joined Fluence about 3 years ago when it was BML Horticulture, small company back then. There was about 10 of us. And it's been a pretty wild ride ever since. Quite a different industry in the horticulture lighting space than the industries I was accustomed to. Those were very large established industries with standards and protocols, and this has been kind of like the Wild West. So it's been great to see it evolve even over the last 3 years, and I look forward to seeing where it goes over the next decade or so.
Very cool. And now, the other Travis came recommended to me by Suzanne Wainwright Evans, the bug lady. She said, if you want to talk to someone about lighting, she had met you and said that you'd just been hired by Fluence, which worked out really well since I'd already been talking about having someone from Fluence on. Can you talk briefly about what your background is?
Sure, I would be happy to. So the past 5 years, I've worked in the ornamental market, so like annuals, perennials, and flowering crops. And what I did there is I worked for a commercial greenhouse in Virginia, and I directed their research and development. And so we did everything from rearing of microorganisms for biocontrols to using light in multiple environments, controlled environments, supplemental, using it on different machinery for photoperiod and flowering, to introducing new products to market, new genetics, new varieties, trialing them in the greenhouse and the landscape. So I wore many hats, let's just say, in that regard to what my role was there.
Very cool. I'm new to lighting. This isn't my area of expertise by any means, so I may ask some really dumb questions. I learned a lot at PhotoX this past year in terms of lighting. But just for listeners who aren't as experienced with lighting, can we go over some of just the basic terminology that people should know when it comes to understanding horticultural lighting?
Yeah, absolutely. And Ted, I think this is probably the foundation where everything starts, and it's widely overlooked, and it's widely, I think, misunderstood in this industry. So most industries you look at, people when they're evaluating something and they're looking at maybe making a big purchase or changing something in their factory, they typically know the terminology and they know the metrics that they're using. What I've found in this industry is that lighting is largely misunderstood and largely unknown, and so people have been making purchase decisions, cultivation decisions, without really understanding the key requirements. And so education is a large part of what we do, and I'll kind of go over maybe about 5 key terms that I think if growers could understand these 5 things, it'll not only make them better in the garden, but then when it comes time to actually making a purchase decision, it can be an educated one. So the first one I'll start off with is called PAR, P-A-R. It's an acronym for photosynthetically active radiation. And that really defines the spectrum of light that plants use for photosynthesis, from 400 to 700 nanometers. So if you look at light is electromagnetic radiation. It's everything from gamma rays to radio waves. And PAR is a very narrow band, kind of in the middle. It also aligns with the visual spectrum. So plants and humans both use the same spectrum of light. Humans use it completely different than plants. And we actually perceive it differently. So where our eyes are, really skewed towards the green portion of the spectrum, plants use 400 to 700 nanometers almost equally, but differently. And so when you're looking at light, the quality of light really has an impact on plant growth and development. So, PAR is a type of spectrum. So I'm sure a lot of people refer to spectrum, and spectrum absolutely has an impact on plant growth and development. So whether something is heavy in red, heavy in blue, heavy in green, heavy in orange, whether it includes UV or far red, it'll absolutely have an impact on plant growth and development. So that's PAR. That's the quality of light that you're looking at, and then you have the intensity of light, and that's defined as PPF, another acronym, stands for photosynthetic photon flux, and that is the amount of light within the PAR region that is emitted by a light fixture. So the total amount of photons that are emitted between 400 and 700 nanometers, that'll give you the PPF of a light fixture. Then the next step there is to add the density to that, so you get PPFD. And that's going to help a grower really know how much intensity is being delivered to their crop. So that's measured in micromoles per square meter per second. And that's going to tell you the light intensity at any given point in time in your crop. And you can measure that with a quantum sensor. You can also get lighting designs. We provide lighting designs that'll give growers a good estimate of what they're going to be receiving. The other measurement that's important is wattage. And I know that's a pretty sticky topic that we'll probably get into later, but wattage is really the measurement of electricity input. It's how much power a light fixture is consuming, measured in watts, 1 joule per second. So wattage doesn't tell you anything about how powerful or how high performing a fixture is in terms of light output. Really, it's just a matter of, what is your electric bill going to be at the end of the day? How many amps are you going to be consuming for a light fixture? So it's definitely a critical requirement in knowing from that regard. But in terms of plant growth, it's not going to tell you anything. And then the final one is efficacy. That's measured in micromole per joule. And I use the analogy of miles per gallon. That's really going to tell you how efficient a fixture is. So if you're trying to determine what the difference is between, two lighting systems from different manufacturers that maybe both consume 500 watts, but they have different claims, you really want to look at the efficacy of that fixture and understand, how efficient is that fixture at converting electrons into photons.
So just so I make sure I understand all these terms correctly myself,
Yeah.
when we when we talk about PPFD, you're talking about light intensity. So how much photons and the density of those photons are going to be actually hitting your canopy or your plant down below. And
That's correct.
When you talk about PAR, you're looking at spectrum. Like when I walk into a hydro shop and see, a Hortilux bulb or a Nanolux bulb on the shelf, and they have those charts on the back with the red and the green spikes, that's your PAR level in terms of the spectrum that you're getting. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, to a degree. You are. You have PPFD down. Now, when it comes to PAR and spectrum, it gets a little more complicated, because within PAR, you can have different allocation of the percentage of light. You can have, for example, a grower could have 1,000 PPFD on one section of their canopy, and they can have 1,000 PPFD on another, but they can have two completely different spectrums of light. So maybe one is, Fluence emits a broad spectrum. It's more of a white light to the eye. And then another one could be kind of that magenta color that I think is more typical of what people think of when they think of LED fixtures. So the light intensity, the PPFD, could be the same, but how that's being generated in terms of the spectrum could be completely different. So one might be 80% red and 20% blue. Mm-hmm. And then that's going to have an impact on the plant development in terms of the allocation of the spectrum within that intensity.
Okay, that makes sense. And then watts, just like you said, how much electricity you're using. It doesn't really tell you how efficient that light is. So what part of that process, as I understand it, is your ballast is going to be generating some level of heat or putting off energy in other forms other than photons, which is really not what we want in most cases, as I understand it. So that the more efficient a light is, the more of that electricity is being translated directly into photons. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, in a perfect world, you would have one electron coming out of the wall, off of the grid, and being transferred and converted into one photon, right? One's a quantum of electricity, one's a quantum of light, but that would be impossible to do. So you're going to have efficiency losses along the way, and those efficiency losses take shape in all kinds of manners, right? Some efficiencies are lost in heat through thermal management. Some losses are on the circuit board, and then you have a matter of how a fixture is designed to cool itself. And some fixtures have active cooling systems with fans, and those fans require electricity to run, right? So you're going to have efficiency losses there. So at the end of the day, when you're looking at efficiency, the goal is to have as high of efficiency as possible so that you can reduce those losses.
And then that makes me think another factor would then be how uniform those photons are being sent to create a canopy or a stamp down below the light fixture itself.
I was going to say, unfortunately, this is a podcast, so I don't have any visuals. When you start talking about uniformity, a visual is really helpful for people to see what that would look like. But you're absolutely right. I mean, and this comes back to why I think horticulture lighting has such a bad reputation, in that you can see how complicated this all can get, and then you can see how you can really play with numbers and play with things to trick customers or consumers into thinking they're getting something that they're actually not. Where if you took a really small bright light fixture over, let's say a 4x4, and you were able to get, let's say 1,000 PPFD, well, you're going to be targeting that over, say, 1 square foot right in the middle. But your average across the canopy is going to be the same as if you distributed that light nice and uniform. And we all know a nice uniform canopy is going to, it's going to produce better results for a lot of different reasons.
Could you give a little bit of a history in terms of sort of where it started and sort of where we are now in terms of these different technologies like metal halides, CMH, LED, HPS?
Yeah. And, the history of lighting for growing relatively corresponds to the history of lighting in general. So if you kind of look back at the history of lighting, I think in larger timescale, it's relatively new technology. I mean, incandescent light was really formed around the early 1900s. And what's scary is if you look at that, I remember growing up, it was the same light bulbs that we used in our house until, pretty recently. That's going to, really inefficient technology. And then you move to fluorescent lighting, which is still very much used in the growing industry today. And that was developed in the 1930s. Again, and these were all developed for industrial, applications, high pressure sodium in the 70s and 80s, and that was designed for street lamps. Metal halide in the 60s, same thing. Automotive, streets, industrial uses. Obviously different spectrum. HPS, has that orange glow to it. Metal halide has that crisp, cool white look to it. And then LEDs started to come around in the 60s as well in the visible spectrum, as semiconductors at large started to proliferate and become more integrated in computers. And so along that way, I think if you look at the history of lighting in agriculture, I think we all have to give a ton of credit to the cannabis industry for helping advance that and really help set some of the operating procedures and what we're using today, where given the legislation of cannabis and how growers weren't able to, plow a field and put it out in the open, they weren't able to, build a greenhouse that everybody could see. They were forced into warehouses. They were forced into garages and closets, and well, there's no sunlight there, right? So you had to rely on sole source lighting, and high pressure sodium was a great technology for that. It was extremely bright, extremely high performance. The efficacy, the energy efficiency was phenomenal at the time. Fluorescent fixtures were below 1 micromole per joule, and then all of a sudden, high pressure sodium was getting up to 1.7. In fact, high pressure sodium was the most energy efficient, highest efficacy lighting system until just a few years ago. Everybody thinks that LEDs are just intrinsically energy efficient. And obviously over the last few years, we've made tons of advancements, and so it's not even really close anymore, but that's been a very recent development. So you can kind of track the history of general lighting to the history of growing. And one of the things that most people kind of ask, well, what's the difference between a grow light and a regular light that you would use in your house? And until recently with LEDs, the answer was nothing, right? People would take the same HPS lamp that was used in a street lamp or a parking garage. They'd put it in a warehouse, and they could grow plants with it. LEDs now give us the flexibility to design custom light intensities, custom spectrum for plant growth. And so it's no longer taking something that was built for a highway and then having to tailor all of your other procedures around that light to make it ideal, changing your irrigation, your fertigation, your nutrient schedule, optimizing your HVAC around something that was never designed specifically for a plant. And now we can take light and specifically design it for a plant. And so it's no longer kind of that limiting threshold.
When I was first starting to grow, the kind of the industry standard was metal halide for veg and HPS for flower. And then these so-called new technologies would show up, like LECs is something I'm seeing a lot of these days that people are recommending or using. And double-ended fixtures with HPS is a relatively new idea as well. Can you just touch a little bit on what some of the differences are between these in a little bit more detail for listeners?
Yeah, so LEC is a marketing term that ceramic metal halide companies used as LEDs started to become a little bit more popular, which I think is, from their perspective, kind of smart, right? So you had LEDs coming online, which everybody associated LEDs with new and high tech and innovative. A lot of other people associate them with a lot of other words, right, as well, in terms of underperforming, high cost, all of that. But at the end of the day, LED was associated with something kind of new and cutting edge. Mm-hmm. And so to associate ceramic metal halide with the same, they just started coming out with LEC. So that's kind of where you get that name from. And then double-ended HPS, from a growing perspective, the advantage there is really all around energy efficiency. and higher performance. So you're moving from single-ended to double-ended, where it changed the cultivation technique quite a bit, right? When you start to increase efficiencies and you're able to get higher light output, you went from hoods where the single-ended might have been much closer to the canopy to get a higher light intensity. So you had air-cooled hoods, and then you were able to move the double-endeds up higher in the ceiling. You could remove some of the different HVAC requirements. So it did change. It changed the landscape quite a bit when they introduced double-ended. And then when you look at why growers were typically using metal halide for veg and HPS for bloom, that was based on, I think, I'm not going to call it rudimentary research, but research at the time that was really looking at spectrum. And so there was a lot of people at the time associated, more blue content with a more compact plant. And metal halide has more blue content than HPS, and then more red and far red content with flower development. And so that's where you started to see the use of those two. Now with more research and the ability to fine tune spectrum with LEDs, down to the nanometer, we can do research that we've never been able to do before to really look at, how truthful is it that blue makes a more compact plant? And we've done research before where we've actually grown cannabis under various spectra of light, and I think we ran one that was about 5 different samples of different spectra of light. And the plant that actually was veg, that was had the longest internode spacing, it stretched the most, was the plant that was actually grown under blue light. And so then you have to start to look at this entourage effect of spectrum and how does blue light integrate with the other spectrum of light to get what we see as a more compact plant. So it's not just what we think of as more blue light, because you take blue light and isolate it, and it does the opposite of what you think it would do.
So is sunlight still the king in this arena? I hear everyone say that nothing beats the sun, and I could see where if we're taking lighting technologies that are not designed for agriculture or for growing plants and just using them to grow plants, that might be the case. But without getting too far into different spectrums, how does sunlight compare? Because I know your light, for example, is a white light. CMH or LEC, since they're the same thing, they're more of a white light as well. Is that sort of full spectrum, or rather than going with these more orange red colors or blue green or purple, like the magenta color you mentioned with LEDs? What's the comparison between all of this, I guess?
I will try to be succinct in answering this. So if I go too long, just stop me, because it's a fascinating topic. And I think this is really where, when you start talking about spectrum and optimizations, we're just getting started. Not only just, we Fluence, we as a species are just getting started to really understand how plants use light and how we can use light as a tool to elicit certain responses out of plants. And so, to answer your question, is the sun still king? I don't know. At the end of the day, we've had customers that have traditionally grown crops outdoors or in a greenhouse using sunlight. They've moved to our systems and they say it's the most flavorful crop they've ever grown. What the sun does is, it provides everything, right? It provides every spectrum of light that a plant could want. Some of it is good and some of it is harmful. When you start looking at ultraviolet light, for example, ultraviolet has some very compelling tendencies to elicit positive responses in plants, but it can also be very damaging. It's a stressor. It stresses the plant. And so if you're stressing a plant at a time when you want to be maximizing its growth, that's going to be a negative response that you're going to want to avoid. If you're providing far red light at the wrong time of the crop's development cycle, again, it could be detrimental. So I think what we really need to do is take the grower and say, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish with this crop? And then take light and use that as a tool to help them accomplish it. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We're working with universities, and we ran research with the University of Tennessee looking at phytonutrients and looking at different compounds, and how can we take these critical compounds that can be used in pharmacology that natively can only be, maybe 0.3% of a crop. And I think the crop we were studying was dill, looking at a compound to help people with vision. And it natively was, very small dose in this plant, but how could we use light? And so we looked at various soul source spectrum, going from really looking at the difference between 400 nanometers and 405 nanometers and 420 nanometers. I mean, the differences between these are incomprehensibly small. But when you look at the results of what that does to a plant and how that affects the chemical compositions of these plants, it's quite dramatic. The most interesting thing that we saw was that you can use light to increase the chemical composition of the plant. You target those specific photoreceptors that are responsible for that development and increase the percentage of that compound, but it came at a cost of yield. So the plant's biomass overall was lower. And so that's where I come back and I have to say, what is your goal as a grower, right? Maybe we can use light to increase THC content or CBD content, but is that going to come at a cost of overall yield? And as companies are moving more towards extracts and they're starting to isolate these compounds and identify really what they're targeting, the answer might be yes or no. So again, very early stages. I think the most fascinating thing is right now we're creating these tools that are going to give researchers the ability to conduct research that they've never been able to do before. In fact, when I joined Fluence 3 years ago, we still had a lot of research partners in academia that were using theatrical stage lighting filters over HPS to conduct this type of research, which is not exactly as precise as you would like it to be.
Wow, so I've always been a soil person, and I've always turned to soil as a way of improving or affecting, terpene expression, the odors and flavors of my crop through manipulating minerals or the biological aspects of a soil. But as I understand it, and from seeing some of your research at PhotoX and other places, essentially lighting spectrum and lighting intensity can have an effect as well on how a plant expresses not just its growth, but also its different phytonutrients as well. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And I might let the other Travis chime in here too. I'll just kind of tee it up with if you look at the role of lighting in plants, there's really two main aspects that light impacts it. One's in growth and one is in development. And if you kind of take a step back and say, what is light? What are we talking about here? Light has a duality nature to it. It's really two things. It's an energy and it's a particle. And so if you look at the energy of the plant and its impact that it has on growth, that's really where intensity comes into play. And then if you look at the particle, and that's really going to be the wavelength of light. That goes back to the spectrum of light. Plants have hundreds of photoreceptors. A lot of them are unknown. And those photoreceptors are all responsible for different things within that plant. So you might have a photoreceptor that's designed to take in, say, 460 nanometers, 370 nanometers, whatever that might be. And then that's going to trigger that plant to do something particular with that wavelength of light. We've been fascinated with chlorophyll. If you look at chlorophyll A and B, right, those are probably the two most popular pigments and photoreceptors of a plant. They're largely responsible for photosynthesis. And they both align with red and blue wavelengths of light. So that's where you see this uprising of magenta and pink lighting. The problem is when you solely isolate those photoreceptors, you're neglecting hundreds of other photoreceptors that are responsible for nutrition, flavor, structural development. So going back to your question, looking at internodal spacing of a plant and everything else, you can absolutely optimize that with light, and it's pretty fascinating. So it's kind of like you're a soil guy, right? And so you're asking, is the sun the best source of light? It's kind of like looking at soil. It's like, well, if you went out and dug a hole in some really rich fertile ground, even if it was, say, in Salinas Valley or something, is that going to be the best soil for a plant, or could you optimize it in a way to get a better response?
Yeah, so one of the things about the sun, as I understand it, is over the course of the summer, the sun spectrum changes slightly, and people have made the argument that a plant, for example, like if we're talking cannabis in this case, it may be after post solstice as it starts to flower, and that lighting spectrum, I believe, is in the sun is going towards more of a red spectrum. That because the cannabis plant, or all annual flowering plants, would be used to this slight slow change in spectrum that the sunlight gives. That's our baseline for optimal, and then they try and recreate this with lighting technology. Is there any foundation or research to support any of that?
That's if I can chime in now, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's interesting because you can track the plant back to its native habitat, right? Try to draw conclusions based on where it originated, to try to figure out how best to make it flower or do whatever you would like it to do. But at the end of the day, there's other environmental factors obviously at play aside from just light. So for some annual crops, you can trump the photoperiod response for flowering with temperature. Right. So, for example, like with garden mums, they're also a short day crop, similar to cannabis. So they flower under short days, and you bulk them under long days. But let's say that you're growing them in the late summer, and the days start to shorten, and you would think flower initiation would go on, but you have a very hot late summer. That heat will delay your flowering. No matter the light quality, no matter the duration of the day, the temperature has automatically trumped your flower initiation. The same can go in relation to light intensity and photoperiod. So when a short day, no matter the spectrum, is supposed to trigger flowering, if you have excessive light levels, but a short day, the light level could trump the response you're looking for from a short day. So I think there's so many other ways to come at it than just taking assumptions perhaps on where it's native to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that brought up a couple other questions. So one, I just want to highlight, when you say photoperiod, that's a new term that we haven't talked about yet. You're talking about the amount of time that the plant is receiving light. Is that correct?
Exactly. So I'll comment on what Travis said on some of the basic terms. And so when you think about light, he mentioned you have three things to think about. You have duration, light quality, the spectrum, and then intensity. So when we're talking about duration, this is the amount of time that the light is actually in contact with the plant, right? So the amount of time the plant is exposed to the light is a term called photoperiod. And photoperiod is key in multiple physiological processes, but one of the main ones specifically for cannabis, obviously, is vegetative growth, bulking, branching, and then flowering growth. So yes, photoperiod is just duration of light.
That brought up a couple other questions that I've had for years and wanted to know the answer to. So what is optimal in terms of vegetative growth? I hear some people say that plants need a dark cycle. I hear other people, and I read an article recently that showed the benefits of a 24-hour light cycle. Have you seen any research on optimal levels? I even saw a really crazy 13-hour flowering chart, or 14-hour, I can't remember correctly, that someone set up, or where lighting's going on for 2 hours and off for an hour, all ways of supposedly maximizing the amount of light that a plant can take in over a given, I think it's DLI, daily lighting, or what's the term exactly for the amount of light a plant can take up over a given period of time?
Sure, it's called a DLI, so a daily light integral. And so this is the amount of light accumulated during a 24-hour period. And so to go to your question, is there a specific sweet spot for, let's say, vegetative growth? I would say there's not yet. You can optimize your environment to be working 24 hours a day, but it's not just due to the photoperiod, and it's not just due to light quality and light intensity. All of these other environmental factors, such as CO2, humidity, soil and root temperature, leaf temperature, airflow, transpiration rate, nutrients, all of these are going to fall into play in combination, or even complementing your light levels and your photoperiod. So the fun thing I see coming from a greenhouse background, now that we're able to focus in on controlled environments, we have the ability to have precision over every single environmental factor. And with that, we're going to find multiple ways to achieve the same thing. because, like I said, with flowering, temperature can manipulate flowering sometimes just as much as photoperiod. So I think there's many different ways to go about it, but in regard to just basic flowering physiology, a long day for cannabis does help with bulking, getting you that carbohydrate buildup in order to, burst out flowers once it's started flower initiation under short days. But I think that's something, not only cannabis, but also controlled environments with, flowering crops, vegetables. We're going to find multiple ways with all of these environmental attributes to get to similar goals.
Yeah, and Chad, if I could chime in on this too, because I think what Travis is hitting on is kind of, we're moving into this kind of new world of crop production with controlled environment agriculture, and if you look at things from a business standpoint, from a commercial standpoint, and you look at all the different ways that you can do something. So whether you're using temperature to control stem elongation or you're using light, you really want to look at what's the most economical way to do that. Which one is going to have the lowest operating cost if they both accomplish the same thing. And if you look at lighting, and you were talking about the period of darkness and the spectrum of light, that's where we're currently underway with a lot of research looking at can you achieve a DLI that is, as far as we know, say optimal for cannabis. Say you can achieve a 35 DLI for cannabis. If you could achieve that in a 8-hour period versus a 12-hour period, could you then have a longer dark cycle where maybe your HVAC isn't running as hard, or maybe you're using peak grid energy less, so you're paying less for that energy, while you're still accomplishing the same yield that you would otherwise? And I think that's where things are going to be fascinating from a business perspective. You start to optimize operations and look at how we can use these techniques. And then when it comes to spectrum as well, there's a lot of research looking at the phytochrome photoequilibrium and the red to far red ratio and what impact that has on flowering. Can you trick a plant? Because the photoperiod isn't actually controlled by the amount of day that the plant receives. It's controlled by the amount of darkness that it receives. And so can you actually, maybe run your lights and flower for 18 hours and trick your plant into thinking that it had that long night cycle so that you can maximize yield? I think that's where things will get quite fascinating.
Now, you guys presented some far red research last year at the conference. Can you just touch a little bit on how some of these lighting, more unique lighting spectrums that are more specialized, and some of the effects that those are having on plant growth?
Travis, I don't know if you have anything that you'd want to talk about. I'm trying to think of anything that I could share right now.
Well, I will say that before I worked with Fluence, or started working at Fluence, I worked with them on a project using different red to far red ratios for flowering of multiple, perennial genera. And what we did learn is that, as Travis stated, each plant has, within the understanding of how plants take in light, they have something called the photoequilibrium and phytochrome and all these photoreceptors. And so certain photoreceptors, perceive a lot of these wavelengths that trigger flowering or trigger certain growth attributes that we're looking for. And so if I could just say anything on it is, the more precise we get on some of these sole, I guess you could just say pigments that we're applying on the plants, we're going to have just precise growth attributes that we'll be able to trigger during different stages of production. If anything, we're learning that. And also in regard to, let's say, leafy greens and herbs, and we could learn from this industry, but they're using, different light quality. So let's say red or blue light towards the end of production to enhance certain phytonutrients, or even using UV, like we stated before, to provoke certain compounds that are desirable, but you don't grow with that spectrum the whole time during production. You just apply it for a 2-hour period every day for the last week of production. So I know our research team is working on some things in that regard, but all these industries are linked. So one thing we learn, they're all plants. How can we bring it all together at the end? So.
Yeah, and I'll build on that with specific to cannabis. I think exactly what Travis just ended with is we can learn a lot from different crops and apply those same techniques across the different species. But even within the same family. So if you look at cannabis, we ran a UV trial with 3 different strains of cannabis, and each one reacted differently. One, we were able to increase the THC content with UV light. One, it didn't really seem to have an impact, and one, it had a detrimental impact. And so from going back from a marketing perspective, right now Fluence sells UV lights, but you will not see us advertising these as like a THC booster or anything like that, because it depends on your genetics. It also depends on how you use that light. And so we still have so much to learn before we can start to advise on how to use some of these tailored spectra to elicit those specific results.
So essentially what I'm getting from this is that these really specific spectrums can have have an impact, or a fairly dramatic impact, on the health and growth of a plant, but the research just hasn't been established enough to really make any broad assertions about that sort of thing at this point. Does that sound right?
It does. It does. And if you think about how some of these studies are conducted, whether they're, with certain lighting vendors or they're with the university, let's say that you have a study underway and you're trialing a certain spectrum with the same variety, but you have other set points, like I said before, of these other environmental factors that in a commercial setting could be completely different. Mm-hmm. So even though you learn something from the study in regard to the light spectrum, you also need to trial different conditions in regard to all of these other environmental conditions to make sure that it could be a consistent result.
Yeah, so there just basically hasn't been enough replication of any of these studies to really draw any good conclusions, because like you mentioned, there's so many variables involved that it's just really hard to know how it will go, or how plants will respond under slightly different environmental conditions other than just the lighting spectrum.
Yep. And I think something that benefits growers is to have, in the horticulture space, what is called grower trials. And this is where, let's say, a grower would work with us, and we could set up a trial specific to their environment, their needs, and then be able to, let's say, recommend something specifically for their goal, because everyone else is going to have a completely different environment. And now that we can tweak every single one of these factors, that's how you truly optimize.
That's really cool. I love that you guys are doing that, because I think that's really what's lacking right now in this industry. Is we're seeing a lot of claims, but not a lot of people doing controlled research that we can actually start drawing conclusions from. So I'm glad that you guys are adding to that overall body of knowledge. That's great. One thing you brought up that I wanted to, it kind of brought up a question in me, was as you know, plant stress is not necessarily always a bad thing. You'll have that grower who always had the crop that got neglected or got pests or something happened, and it ends up being their highest yielding and or highest THC crop that they've grown. And I know in Italy, I read a really cool article about how the farmers would flood their tomato fields with salt water at a certain period during that plant's growth as a way of stressing the plant, creating, forcing it to put its energy into its fruiting. And so that tomato had, better flavor in it, for example. Have you seen any ways or research around lighting and plant stress and in terms of optimization, or ways that we can maybe utilize lighting as a way of improving bud quality or flowers?
I'll speak a little to this, because I did work with plant stress in general for part of my thesis. But it's interesting, in regard to flowering or fruiting, when a plant is under stress, it's going to take whatever energy it has and just reproduce. It's kind of like the last resort. If it's going to die, it might as well just reproduce, right? So you can induce flowering through stress. And stress, yes, can be through lighting, can be, either from, I would believe, light quality and also light intensity combined. You could have different stressors there. But you can also have, certain responses that also have different advantages to them. So, like if you were to give a plant, let's just say, an exposure of a harsh UV wavelength, you could produce a certain compound in the plant that attracts predator insects. And I know there's been work done at Kansas State in regard to this. Or that you give a certain dose or high-intensity light pulse, and you can provoke certain compounds in the root zone to be resistant to pathogen, entrance into the soil. So I don't know specifically, and Travis, you may be able to speak to this better than me, but I think plant stress has a place. It's just on how do we approach it.
Yeah, Travis, did you want to add anything else to that? Other Travis?
No, I think that just piggybacks off of what I was saying around UV light, in that absolutely you can use light as a stressor. And like you said, stress has its place in terms of benefits for crops. It's just really, when it comes to lighting, we don't know and we can't prescribe when that optimal time will be. So, do we want to use it maybe say during the scleral period at night and blast the plant with some UV light, or do we want to do it during the main flowering stage? Those are all the research projects that need to take place, and it's genetic specific, it's environment specific. We've ran more trials than I can count where unfortunately the data comes back inconclusive, because we will be running, say, a UV trial to determine if we can use UV light to, increase the quality of cannabis. And then halfway through the study, the grower will have an HVAC problem. And so for 3 days of that cycle, their temperature or their diff or their RH is completely out of sync. And so the results come back and you say, well, are those results accurate, or was that a result of different environmental conditions? And, get cannabis flowering alone is, a couple months. And then you have to add in the time to cure the plant, test the plant. And so each of these trials takes a few months. It takes about 3 or 4 months. And so if you have one thing go out of step, which typically do in a commercial growing environment, you have to start all over. So unfortunately, the research process takes quite a while.
Yeah, I'm excited though to see where this all takes us in terms of plant stress, because you are opening up the door too for more pathogens, poor growth, or potentially less yield, depending on, like other Travis mentioned, the types of stress or the amount of stress. It's like you're towing this thin line that you don't really know what's going to set it off either one way or another. But I've never heard of being able to give lighting spectrum and actually affect the ability of a plant to attract certain insects or repel other pathogens. I would love to learn more about that as you guys learn more.
Yeah, and hearing you talk about this, it reminds me of not just looking at it as a stressor, but as a beneficiary outside of plant growth or development. We did a trial with the University of Florida. Basil downy mildew is probably the number one issue with basil crop growers, and they'll use different techniques to help prevent it and keep it at bay. I think sulfur is one of the most prominent. But we actually looked at using different spectra of light and concluded that we can use specific red wavelength of light to suppress basil downy mildew. And so when you start looking at using light outside of just a tool for photosynthesis or photomorphogenesis, you start looking at it as a part of your IPM strategy. Then you start to, can start to look at using light in a multitude of ways.
Are you guys working with anyone that's using it right now for suppression of powdery mildew or botrytis with cannabis?
No, we did prior work for Fluence using blue light in reference to making fungus sporulate. So in certain cases, some spectrums actually enhance, spore count in certain fungi, which is not a good thing. And then also we did work on using UVC to kill botrytis on contact with certain hormic doses, just pulses. But I think that research, if anything, it's just now really starting to be part of the conversation in regard to cultivation.
Okay, that's really exciting. I can't wait to hear what you guys come up with in the next few years. So that's great. I wanted to get back to some of these questions I'd written out before our talk that were sort of basic, but really captured some of my questions from back in the day. And one of them was that I always thought that LEDs in general were too expensive and they seem to produce poor yields. And I've noticed more and more improvements in the LED, lighting arena and that technology. I know when it first came out, I always said it just wasn't there yet. Do you guys feel like we're there yet? It seems like we are. Can you just talk a little bit about where we're at with LEDs?
Yeah. So you're right. They were too expensive. They didn't perform. And, unfortunately, it's created this negative impression for LED technology in the horticulture space. And I mentioned, earlier when I was talking about my background, I joined Fluence. I left a Fortune 500 company where being in the marketing department at a Fortune 500 company, it doesn't matter who your boss is or what your title was. You reported to the legal team. Everything that you put on paper, everything that you said had to be run through legal. And if there was even one iota of some kind of claim, it had to be substantiated and proven, right? So that we don't get sued. In the horticulture lighting space, there was nothing. There was none of that. I joined and I did a competitive analysis, and I was appalled at the claims that these other lighting companies were making that were completely unsubstantiated. We have competitors that would just literally put like guaranteed higher yields. And it's like, okay, well, guaranteed or what? And if you give your light to somebody that doesn't know the first thing about growing, how are you going to guarantee better yields? Everybody, I think, was the highest performing LED or the highest performing light. Everybody would, you'd have a 300 watt LED system that would outperform a 1,000 watt HPS. And it was appalling. And I told my boss, Nick, the CEO of the company, we'll never do that. We'll never do that. We have to build credibility. Let's take a different approach. And so it's been an uphill battle, kind of going against the headwind that LED manufacturers created, probably going back to maybe five years ago or so, where they would come in and the technology was not there. The LEDs themselves were not efficient enough. They weren't powerful enough. The packages, and then the people that were building these quote unquote grow lights, a lot of them did not know the ins and outs of horticulture. And so nowhere on their labels would you see the PPF, would you see the efficacy, would you see PAR maps that would show you the light uniformity that they were getting. And so you had buyers that were buying things based off of claims and hearsay and marketing that was false. I think the industry has become much more educated. People are, lighting is continuing to evolve. The commercial horticulture industry is continuing to evolve. And so you're seeing, I think, more respectful horticulture lighting companies come out that are trying to do things the right way. And at the same time, the growing community is becoming more educated, which is only putting pressure on lighting companies to adapt to that. And you're starting to see more standards being implemented. The DLC, the Design Light Consortium, who typically have helped to build standards and regulations in the industrial space, so that when you go to buy a light for your home, that you can look on that box and it has all of the critical specifications listed, so you know what you're buying. They're now working in the horticulture space, and they'll be coming out with a specification that will help bring more clarity to the growing community. So you'll have these standards, and the lighting companies need to start playing by the rules. And it's not going to be perfect when it starts. They're still going back to how much is unknown. It's there will be standards put in place that may hinder growth. If you kind of look at the pace of innovation in the automotive or the aerospace industries, it is slow. It goes at about a snail's pace because of all the regulations and standards that they have to conform to. So on one hand, it's good because you have a very high safety rating because you're not just throwing in unproven components. On the other hand, the adoption of innovation is pretty slow. And so I think horticulture lighting has been kind of unregulated, just running loose and wild, and it's come at a detriment in the cost to the growing community. So getting some kind of standards in place will help us. So I hope that answers your question in terms of the history of, about why we got here. And then to answer your question, absolutely, we're here now. The costs are continuing to go down as LEDs continue to proliferate and the underlying technology behind them continues to proliferate. And then as, companies like Fluence start to become larger and we grow, the commodity of scale only helps us reduce our pricing that we pass on to customers. And I'd be remiss if I didn't really acknowledge the cannabis industry for fueling that growth. The food production industry right now is they don't have the margins that cannabis has. They don't have the flexibility to take risks and adopt new technology that cannabis has, because if they fail, that could be bankruptcy for them. Whereas the cannabis industry, I think natively is risk takers, more entrepreneurs, and they are helping to adopt new ag tech that as those technologies are proven, as those companies scale and grow and they're able to reduce their pricing, then the food industry can look at it and say, okay, that seems to be proven, that seems to be working, and now the pricing is dropping because these technologies are being adopted on a more wide scale, right? Which ultimately, if we can help the food industry become more sustainable and more efficient, everybody wins.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I think that's wonderful. I will say that here in Washington and Oregon, we're seeing we're at a point now where so much cannabis has been produced relative to what's being consumed or purchased that a lot of growers are struggling, and they're having to look at ways at improving efficiency, not just from a lighting perspective, but from an overall business perspective. And here's where I think LEDs really shine. Though there is still a higher cost of entry, it appears, than, say, a double-ended HPS, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, seems to be the closest equivalent to a well-made LED light. But you more than make that up in terms of the amount of electricity and efficiency that you're getting out of the LED fixture over the life of that fixture. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I will not hide from the price of our fixtures. In fact, Fluence is very open about the pricing. We don't play games. We have standard pricing, and our fixtures on day one are absolutely more expensive than high pressure sodium. The onus is on us as a company to make sure that our customers can get a quick payback on these systems. So it costs. These are high-tech systems, right? These are new technology, high-tech systems. They cost more to build. The amount of people that go into the research and the support behind them costs more to support these. And so the price is higher, but we look at, from a business standpoint, energy efficiency and lowering your utility bill are absolutely, something to look at and consider. The maintenance cost is something to consider. Those are all secondary to helping our customers improve revenue. Looking at, can we help you increase your yield? Can we help you increase your quality? Can we help you maintain a better shelf life or consistency so that your forecasting is better, so that your shrink is reduced and you have less loss, crop loss? We take in all of these factors, and we don't tell the customer, hey, you're going to get 10% more yield. You're going to get 5% more yield. You're going to get 20% more yield. We don't tell them that they're going to reduce their shrink, which hopefully Travis, he can talk about that as well from his past company. We don't tell them that. What we do is we try to show them that is all possible. And then we allow them to say, you know what, I think you're right. If I can get, say 10% more light or 20% more light, and I can get these other factors, I can reduce my HVAC costs. They plug it in the model and they do a payback analysis. And if we can't be efficient at providing a payback within a time frame that is suitable for our customers, then we need to go back and we need to adjust it. But I think if you look at the adoption of Fluence if you just look at Fluence in the adoption of the cannabis industry, both from home growers, hobbyists at home that are using one light, to the world's largest growers that are using thousands of lights, it's clear that it makes sense for everybody, large and small.
Yeah, it's funny. I was joking around when we first started this podcast, and I was interviewing some of the people that I know in the cannabis industry that I consider to be influencers, like my buddy Jaya Palmer, David Bernard Perrone up at TGOD, Nelson Lindsley with Poetry of Plants. And I told him, I'm like, guys, I don't want this to turn into a Fluence podcast, because we keep talking about their name when we talk about lighting, just because what you guys are doing is very innovative, and you are doing a lot of research to support the industry, and I think that's amazing. I don't want to sound like there aren't other companies, lighting companies out there doing good things too in the industry, and I think that's important to highlight. And I think people just need to really do their research, and you've kind of given us some tools here today with this terminology and other information in terms of how to evaluate a light or a lighting system. But in your eyes, what separates Fluence from some of these other lighting companies out there?
I'll speak to that one. So when I was on the other side, so I guess you could consider me a buyer, one thing that I did really appreciate about Fluence, even though at the same time I was trialing multiple other lighting technologies, for one, when it comes to a grower that's making a large investment in, going through all of these decisions and building a new controlled environment or greenhouse or whatever it may be, when you have somebody who can help you from the start, not just in regard to lighting, but every other thing that you need to think about in regard to photobiology and plant physiology, Fluence was extremely helpful. And from that side of it, I came to respect Fluence, and hence why I'm here as their director of cultivation support now. They care enough to have a whole division that is meant to help the grower learn how to maximize these technologies while at the same time appreciating and also learning about all the other factors that influence plant growth. So to me, that's of high value with Fluence.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that and kind of reiterate, really I think the intimacy with our customers and in our research partners in parallel, kind of having a vision that goes beyond just having the best product. If you look at our products in terms of their specifications, they're world-class, they're great, but that's short-term, right? So being able to work with our customers, understand the ins and outs of their business, what are their goals, how do they succeed, and how can we help them succeed, keeps us focused on moving forward and not being complacent and saying, okay, great, we just created a light that works. Now let's sell them. So, customer success has been from day one our key focus.
What got me excited about your company was the fact that I heard that a large commercial basil grower was using your lights. The fact that someone outside of the cannabis industry and that you guys were working with people in agriculture was able to be profitable using your lighting technology, I think is huge. You don't see that with a lot of companies, and the fact that you're doing all this research with Cornell and some of these other research universities that are known for ag is really what sold me on your company.
Yeah, that's key. All these plants are connected, whether we're talking about basil, cannabis, petunias. A lot of what we learn from one can be applied to the other. So we find value in learning from multiple live goods industries instead of just focusing on one where, let's say in some cases, it could be limited on what we learn.
Yeah, and I would I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about a study that we're doing right now with Dr. Bruce Bugbee at Utah State University. He's a leading plant physiologist, and I kind of talk about how much we don't know right now. And we define PAR going back to the very beginning of our conversation as 400 to 700 nanometers, and the study we're doing right now is to debunk that. We're actively looking to say, is this true? Is this knowledge that we are building on true, or is there room for improvement? And so by working with the growers, and as the commercial horticulture industry rapidly evolves due to disruptions in technology and growing populations, at the same time giving these researchers tools to continue to, give us the knowledge to make them more efficient, is going to be, I think, radically changing how people grow plants in the future.
I don't want to extend this podcast too much longer because I've taken so much of your day already, but I did have a question in terms of, it made me think of plant myths associated with lighting. So one of the, like we talked a little bit about optimal veg photo periods, and you guys didn't give me like an exact general recommendation, but you kind of explained why. I'm wondering, in terms of like those green headlamps, do plants see that green light? I've always heard that they don't, but does that have a potential to affect the health of your crop if people are using green lights to go in during a dark cycle?
No, I would say there's not. I've not heard of that being beneficial at all. And to me, there is
detrimental.
Yeah, that anything you could possibly be disturbing the photo period by having any light on at all, depending on your other factors. Even though we say photo periods triggered by far red or red, even if you have some other light, if it's at a certain intensity, you could still trigger a photo period response. So if you have a dark period, and like Travis said, a lot of plants' responses are due to having the dark period as their photoreceptor key. I certainly would not have any other lights on during the dark period.
Yeah, Tad, if you look at why people use green lights, if they have to go into a room when the lights are off, that comes from that misconception that plants don't use green light, and so
yeah,
that's where it comes from. That's why people choose green. It's probably the least disruptive, but it's still, like Travis said, it still would have an impact, especially given the duration and intensity that you go in there with. So obviously I don't think people are seeing any detriment when they go in there with their little headlamps. But if you were to turn on high intensity green lamps in there during the photo period, you absolutely would see an impact.
So that just kind of made me wonder, are there any other sort of like lighting myths or sort of established things in the industry that you guys have found to just not be very accurate?
Well, I would use this time to simply say watts per square foot. I know that's not like photobiology related, but using watts per square foot to try to determine, how much light you need is not accurate. So
what should we be using?
PPFD.
Okay. One other question that reminded me of was when I first started looking at lights, people were using the term lumens, but that's not something you guys have mentioned once in this talk. Can you touch on that real quickly?
Travis, I'll mention one thing here. So that there's many terms out there, also depending on where you are in the world, on how you refer to light in general. And so let's say early in the horticultural industry, they referred to light as foot candles, right? And this was based on what you could see. So you made your judgment based on what you could visually see. And what we've learned with LEDs is we can't trust what we see. We have to trust in the technology now because it's surpassed our ability to just perceive exactly what's going on. So some of these units of measure in some ways are, I don't know if you could call them legacy units of measure, but we've surpassed them with our understanding. So we now use PPFD and micromoles, as a common cohesive understanding of light, or light specifically for biological processes in plants. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we all need to be on the same page instead of terminology is what you're saying, so that we can compare apples to apples.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, that and making sure we're using the right terminology for the right application. So light is used for many things, and if you're trying to determine, what lighting is best for your plants, but you're using human-based metrics for vision, things will not go well. And you could just take, if you take a ceramic metal halide fixture that has a really cool white visual appeal to it, and then you take, say, our spectrum, which has a very similar look. To the human eye, they look very similar. Now, if you look at them on a spectroradiometer, in terms of how plants perceive them, they're dramatically different. So it's just making sure that you're using the right metrics based on the appropriate application.
That's a really good point, because you're right, they do look very similar to me, and I don't always think about the fact that there's a lot going on that I can't see. So I guess where I would kind of wanted to finish up this podcast with, and maybe other Travis, we could talk again about some of your background in terms of environmental controls. I'd love to have you back on to talk more about that, because I know you're a wealth of knowledge there. But where do you guys see the future of lighting headed? I know we've touched on some of these different things that are obviously that we're not there yet on, but is there anything else in terms of where we're going with lighting?
Well, me and Travis have actually spoken about this a few times, and so my understanding, especially after coming to Fluence now, is the next step with light in general for plant applications is to have kind of intelligent lighting systems, right? So every single one of your factors are all controlled together and cohesively. Travis, I'll let you elaborate more on that topic.
Yeah, I think you have to look at the future. I think I look at it in two different ways. Kind of the immediate future, maybe within the next 5 years, and then the quote unquote distant future, 5, 15 years from now, which will probably come much quicker than any of us expect. But if you look at the immediate future, it's definitely going to be about continued efficiencies in the platform, lower costs, increased performance, really fine-tuning spectrum as we unlock more research, and getting the pieces of the puzzle built for intelligence. So when you look at the Internet of Things, and you look at connectivity, and you look at big data, you look at everything that we're doing in our personal lives with computing and smart homes, networking, bringing that into the garden to make things more efficient, I think we'll be here relatively soon. And then you can start to automate the garden, and you can start to bring a level of intelligence and sophistication to it that we've never had before in our food supply chain. And so the other Travis and I were talking about this a couple weeks ago, especially as it relates to his role, which is, Fluence right now is taking very much an educational approach, really trying to educate our customers on photobiology and horticulture lighting, and educating our customers across the spectrum. I mean, that's Travis's job, is to help out with all these other factors outside of lighting, but the interplay of lighting. And I think soon, our role is going to shift from, and I think academia and the industry at large will shift from educating growers on, how to spec botrytis, how to detect a nitrogen deficiency, to how to manage a robot that does that, how to program a system that can detect that and then maintain those systems. So you're going to see a whole shift, and lighting will definitely be a component of that, an integral component of that, as more intelligence is brought to the farm.
That's exciting, and I love what you guys are doing. So I just want to say thank you for taking the time to do this. I really enjoyed this podcast. I learned a lot myself, even just chatting with you guys about some of the direction that lighting's heading. It's really exciting. So thank you both, Travises, and I would love to do a follow-up podcast, if you're open to it, on some of the environmental controls around lighting and how important they are, if you're open to it.
Sure. No, I'd be happy to.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, and I look forward to talking to you guys soon.
Thanks, Ted. Keep doing what you're doing. Appreciate it.
That was Travis Williams and Travis Higgenbotham, both with Fluence Bioengineering, manufacturers of LED lighting for the horticultural industry. Their website is fluence.science, or you can type Fluence Lighting into Google and it will be the first link. Fluence is spelled F-L-U-E-N-C-E. You are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey. Don't forget that there's more information and articles available on our website and blog at www.kisorganics.com, as well as links to the data and information we discussed in this episode on the podcast page. Thanks for listening.